Okay, how many of you have seen Chariots of Fire? I know it's an old movie, but most of you at least have heard that song, right? And this morning, what we're talking and going through being deeply rooted and talking about spiritual disciplines, we're going to talk about Sabbath today. And so if you think about that when it comes to the movie Chariots of Fire, it's the only movie that I'm aware of that Sabbath and talking about the Sabbath is kind of part of the plot line about what's going to happen in the movie. And so if you're not familiar with that, it's a story about Eric Liddell, and he was a 100-meter sprinter. He was very good at running, and he was going up against, what was his name? Harold Abrams, right? And Harold Abrams was his competitor, and they were always going up against each other, and Harold would always he would never be beat by Eric. Eric could always beat him every time. And Harold always said this. He said, I have 10 seconds to justify my existence when I get out there and run the 100-meter, because he wanted to win the gold in the 1924 Olympics. And so that is what was driving him. He had that internal murmuring of self-reproach in his life that you're never good enough unless you can run this fast, if you can do it like this, if you can beat Eric Liddell. And so they come to the Olympics, and it's a 100-meter dash, and they find out that Eric finds out that it is on Sunday morning, that the race was going to happen on a Sunday. And as a Christian, he wanted to observe the Sabbath, and he wanted to take that day off. And so he chooses to withdraw his name, even though he was favored to win the 100-meter dash and win gold. He withdraws. And Abrams does run it, and he wins the gold for the 100-meter dash. Now, Eric Liddell eventually goes on to run the 400, 4x4, and he wins the gold there, and he goes off to be in China as a missionary, and he dies there during the Japanese internment camp in China. But for Eric, it didn't bother him that he didn't get the gold. That for him, his identity was so much more secure that he was willing to rest and not have to have that internal murmuring, that self-reproach that I'm not good enough, that I have to prove myself, I have to produce, I have to get this gold medal. And he was able to release all that. Unlike his partner Abrams, who that meant everything to him. That's how he proved that he was worth something, is what he chose to do. And so that's what we want to talk about today, is just a little bit about resting. And that's kind of a problem for us, isn't it, in our society? We kind of have the condition of thinking that we can do it all. We can accomplish it all. We've got all these desires, and we want to start this business and do this, and I want to go here, and I want to climb this mountain and do all these different things. And so, am I off now? Okay. Is it not? Thank you. Am I just going to do this here? Okay. All right. We'll just move to the old school mic. Okay, so where was I? All right, so what we're talking about here is we sometimes have that busyness, that infinite desire to always want to do everything and accomplish and work harder and do all these things. And I recently heard about this book by this guy named Oliver Burkeman, and he's like a British journalist. I think he writes for the New York Times and a bunch of different places. So he's not a Christian, but he wrote this book called 4,000 Weeks is what he called it. And it's like a time management book, but what he's saying is, in the book he says, you don't have all the time in the world. If you live to 80, you got about 4,000 weeks to accomplish everything that you want to do in your life. Now, if you lived past 80, you're on borrowed time. But, good job, Bug. But, well, that's what he said in the book. His words, not mine. And so 4,000 weeks is what he says. You all have that time. And so you've all heard the thought experiment about, you got to make priorities. Take the boulders in a jar, and you put the big boulders in first, and then you can make room for the pebbles and the sand, right? And so he talks about priorities. But what he says is that thought experiment is flawed, because you don't have all the time in the world to make sure you can get all the boulders you want in, to make sure you can do everything that you want to do in this life. But sometimes we live as if we have more than 4,000 weeks, that we can accomplish it all, we can do it all, we can make it all work. And for the Israelites back during the time of Moses, they didn't have 4,000 weeks. They actually had 3,429 weeks of which they could manage their time. And you can check my math, but that meant that one day a week they would rest from choosing what they would do and how they would live their life. So for us, though, where the angst comes in is a lot of times, this quote from Carl Rayner, he says, "In the torment of the insufficiency of everything attainable, that we can make it all happen, we learn ultimately in this world there are no finished symphonies." So think of that word picture. We try to make everything happen. We work so hard to make and achieve and accomplish and do all these things. And in the end, we never fully finish the symphony. It's left disjointed. It's never quite finished. And so what happens to us when we get into that period of thinking we can accomplish it all, we can do it all, this restlessness starts to set in. And that's the result of us, our just infinite desires and accomplishments and wanting to work and do all these things. It clashes with our finite bodies that has 4,000 weeks to accomplish everything in life. And so no matter how much we see, no matter how much we do, it's like an itch that no matter how many times you scratch it, it doesn't go away. No matter how much you see, you travel, you buy, you sell, you accomplish, you do these things, you always are left with the symphony unfinished. And it's never quite what we'd hoped for. And so nothing in this life apart from God can really satisfy those desires. But when we start to chase those desires of trying to do this, we end up with a chronic state of restlessness. And then it leads to angst and anger and anxiety and disillusionment and depression and all these things. And then we just try to drown it out and numbing it by living a life that's hurried, busied, overworked. We're doing all these things, so we just try to shop it away, watch it away, work it away, device it away. And then it just leads to a vicious cycle, right? And then it leads to more anxiety and more angst and more disillusionment about what's going on in our life. And then culture doesn't help us with that situation, does it? This guy Comer says that culture has the twin gods of accumulation and accomplishment. That constantly is pushing us in those directions that we've got to get more, we've got to accomplish more. And advertising monetizes that restlessness in us, doesn't it? They say we see about 4,000 ads a day, possibly, of just feeding, watch this, be this, wear this, do this. And in the end, it doesn't lead to rest. It leads to this angst and this restlessness that we continue to have. And then social media doesn't help with the accomplishment, does it? Because you see on social media and look at all the places, look at them, they're over skiing in the Alps and they're on that little gondola in Italy, and you just see all these different things and look at how well this person's life's going and how everything, and why am I not accomplishing? You start to have this restlessness in your soul that my life compared to them is not what it should be. And yet we all know that they're filters, right? They don't show their divorces. They don't talk about their depression. They don't talk about the bad things in their life. They only want to talk about the things that look glamorous and good, and it feeds into the fact that we feel restless about where we're at in our life as well. And there's the famous quote, right, from Augustine, where he talks about this restlessness, and he says, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you." And so that's what we want to talk about today is how do we come in a world that's so hurried and that's so busy and so focused on accomplished to come to that point of having true rest in God. And so the way that God orchestrates and figures that out of how we come to have that true rest is through Sabbath. And the word for Sabbath comes from the Hebrew word Shabbat. Shabbat shalom, right? And so the word, it literally means to stop. Stop working, stop wanting, stop worrying, stop trying to accumulate, stop trying to accomplish. It just says you are supposed to take a day and just stop. And so this is first introduced to the children of Israel in the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. And so in Exodus chapter 20, you can see it says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And then he gives an example. What that looks like is 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But on the seventh day, it's a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And on it you should do no work. And he says, nobody else, not even your servants, not even your animals, even the strangers and the aliens that live in your land are not supposed to work. But everyone's supposed to rest. Because he says, therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and he made it holy. Now, we're all familiar with the Ten Commandments. And a lot of times the Ten Commandments are just short and sweet. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, and God doesn't have to explain to us why he's giving this. You know, it's pretty self-obvious why we shouldn't be doing some of these things, or at least it should be. And when it comes to the Ten Commandments, this one, it's long. There's a lot that God says about why he's instructing us to stop and to rest. And so I love what he says at the beginning. Moses writes, remember the Sabbath. So what's that pointing back to is obviously Genesis chapter 2, right? Where God, he creates the world. He creates it in 6 days. On the seventh day, he blesses it. He makes it holy, and he rested from all the creation that he did. And so they said, look, you've never experienced Shabbat. You've never experienced this type of rest, Israelites, but remember that God did this. And so they ground it in the creation order. And the reason that God sets aside a day to rest is not because he's exhausted like we are, not because he's overworked or he's really tired, which is a lot of reasons why we have to choose to rest, but God rests to set an entire day aside to delight in the world that he made. You know, if you look in Genesis, God will say, and that's good, and this is good. And then on the Sabbath day, he steps back and he looks at it all and he says, man, that's very good. And so that's what God's calling us to do to Shabbat, to stop, to Sabbath, to be able to delight in the world that he gives. And so if you look in the Genesis passages there, God actually blesses three things. He blesses the animals and tells them to be fruitful and multiply. He blesses the humans and tells them to be fruitful and multiply. And I have followed that recently. And then the third thing that he blesses in that passage is a day. He blesses the Sabbath. He blesses a day. And so if you think about that, when God blesses the Sabbath, he's showing that it has the same life-giving ability as the animals to procreate and as humans to procreate. That it has ability to give us life. And that could even not be considered hyperbole. I read this article about this guy, this doctor named Dan Buettner. And he had been studying the Seventh-day Adventists. And if you know anything about Seventh-day Adventists, they're very legalistic about you must worship God on the Sabbath, on Saturday, and you must hold to that. And so he said this. He said that the Seventh-day Adventists lived 10 years longer than most average Americans, is what he determined. And he attributed it to them being legalistically strict about the Sabbath. So if you do the math, if you Sabbath every 7 days, it'll add 10 years to your life. And so if you believe in what this doctor's saying, but he's saying that there is something that happens to us in every area and sphere of our life that is life-giving, maybe even prolonging our life by practicing the Sabbath. And so when you see the Israelites, and even before that, Comer talks about this. He says, the Creator God, he's not found in a place but a day. So if you wanted to meet with God, Yahweh of the Old Testament, you didn't have to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. You didn't have to go to Stonehenge. You didn't have to go to this great temple, but you just had to Shabbat. You had to just stop long enough to experience him. And that's how God had set it up at the beginning. So Sabbath is an invitation to a life that isn't dominated or distorted by overwork. Now, I'm not saying work, because God gives work in the garden, right? So work is a good thing. But by dominating and distorted by overwork. And so the Sabbath in the Old Testament, and was a weekly 24-hour period of unhurried delight, of no have-tos, no ought-tos, that resulted in deep rest and renewal for their bodies and their souls. And so we see here that God gives this in the Ten Commandments. And I just wanted to make this clear that the Ten Commandments were never given as a means to salvation, but it was more of the result of a salvation. So God never intended the Ten Commandments to be means by which people entered into a relationship with God, right? Because remember the story? God first rescued his people out of Egypt, and then he gave them the Ten Commandments. He didn't give them the Ten Commandments to live out perfectly, and then if you do that, that's a condition on which I'll rescue you and I'll take you out of Egypt. So that's the good news, that God's care and love for you is not based on how well you perform and how well you live. His love comes first, and it's unconditional. And so the Ten Commandments then are given based off that love, based off that rescuing redemption. And instead, what you do when it comes to the Ten Commandments is what he's asking his people is the way of life for those who describe what it looks like to be redeemed and rescued by God and how they should live out their life. And so this is what you see here when it comes to the Sabbath, is this is a gift that God gives to his people. And if you look in Deuteronomy chapter 5, this time he's reiterating the Ten Commandments, but it's a new generation. So you remember the old generation that came out of Egypt, they screwed it up, they disobeyed, they didn't want to go into the land, and so they had to wander in the desert till they died off. So this is the second generation. And so look what he says here in Deuteronomy 5. He says, observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, is what he says. It's different. The first time in Exodus he says, remember. This time he says, observe it as holy to the Lord as he commanded you. And then if you look in verse 15, he says, you shall remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So the first word is different. First they said, remember what God did in creation, and now they say observe the Sabbath. Remember to keep that. And so think about that. When we observe a holiday, what do? When we have Christmas, what we do, we get geared up for it. There's an anticipation. You got to plan in advance for it. You try to make it special. And so what the Sabbath was supposed to be, it was like a holiday every week. You were supposed to gear up for it, anticipate it. But the great thing about the Sabbath, it didn't have all the stress of Christmas or the family drama of Christmas. Isn't that great? But you were supposed to every week just have this time of stopping and resting. And that's what it was supposed to be like. So in Exodus, the Sabbath command was grounded in the creation story. Remember what God did. And in Deuteronomy, the command is grounded in the Exodus story. Remember that you were slaves. Now you are free from that slavery to Sabbath that you never were able to do before. So in Deuteronomy, this generation grew up with the freedom. Their parents were slaves, but they were not. And so Moses says, don't go back to your slavery. Don't go back to that place. Remember that you were slaves to an empire that didn't care about you. They cared about you. Your life mattered to the degree that you could build bricks. And how many bricks can you build? And can you make this pyramid happen? And we will just grind your life into the dust and work you to death until we can get the next person to replace you. And so they were just a line item on a spreadsheet, bottom line, whatever it takes. And he says, listen, remember you were slaves. Remember that you never rested before. Don't go back to that. Because we're going to see that we all have the inclination to go back to that slavery. You know, Rene Descartes, if you remember from Philosophy 101, right? What does he always say? He says, I think, therefore I am. Well, for the Israelites during the Exodus, it was, I work, therefore I am. I work, I produce, I make bricks, and therefore, that's how I know I exist. That's how I know I have meaning. That was their meaning and purpose for 400 years. And yet for us today, we can sometimes have that mentality as well. I work, I produce, and therefore that's why I know I exist. I have meaning, I have purpose, I have value.
And work is a good thing, right? But then you take that to the extreme and you become overworked and you forget that ultimately as a Christian, that's not your ultimate value, is being able to work all the time. And so the Sabbath, what it really means is freedom. It's we're not bound and controlled by activity so much and work so much that we can't cease from it regularly. But we're freed from that. That we aren't slaves to our jobs, we aren't slaves to our company, slaves to our boss, slaves to what people say, but we have this ability to be free. And I love what Brueggemann says. He's an Old Testament commentator. He says Sabbath was an act of resistance. To resist the urge of always being hurried, resist the urge of workaholism or globalism or materialism or all those isms out there that can be bent and used in wrong ways to be able to get us to be slaves again, to focus on this all the time. But Sabbath helps us to resist the urge that we don't have to be slaves and controlled by that anymore. So what we really need to do is you enjoy the time that you already have. That's what Sabbath is, a stop and look at what God has given you. Look at what you have. And so sitting with God and enjoying the things that he's given you is something materialism promises but can never deliver, and that's contentment. Because materialism will say, well, if you just buy this, if you just do this, if you just get this, if you just work a little harder, then you'll be content. Then you'll be happy. But Sabbath helps you to be able to say, stop and look at what you already have and learn to enjoy that contentment. And so you see in the Old Testament, they talk about keeping the Sabbath, but really the Sabbath is what kept the Israelites. It kept them from being slaves. It kept them from going back into the way that they were before. And it set them apart from everyone else in their society that never took a break, that never stopped, that just kept going. And that restlessness just kept causing them to be wound up. And so for us, our bodies are made to rest as well. And if we deny that, then we're eventually forced to rest. Our bodies will come to a point where either for sickness, injury, or emotional breakdown, our bodies will just say, I have to take a break. And some of you all experience that in different seasons of your life where you just pushed and you pushed and you pushed, and then you just came to a breaking point, or you know people like that. Because that's the way that God has set about how, as humans, we're to operate and how we're to work. And one of the greatest examples of trying to change this was from the French Revolution. You remember that before Napoleon Bonaparte took over. But they tried to de-Christianize everything. And so they got rid of the Sabbath and they moved to a 10-day work week. And you know how many years that lasted? 12 years before they decided we're not going to do that anymore. Because they thought, you know what, it'll increase productivity if we go to 10 week and it's going to make things better. But what it ended up doing is it made it worse. Suicides were up. Animals dying of exhaustion were up. But you know what wasn't up? The economy and production. Because God has given us, it's woven into the fabric of creation itself that we work 6 days and we rest 1 day. And so fighting against this is like fighting God's design for the world and how we're to operate. And when you go against the grain that God has set up in creation, you get splinters. And so God, isn't this interesting here? You see in the 10 Commandments that God has to command the Sabbath. He has to command them to stop and rest. Do you find that odd that God has to command rest? That'd be like God saying, I command you to have ice cream once a week. I command you to go to the beach. That one doesn't translate here, does it? I command you to go to Rio Dosa, right? Or it's odd to us that God would command that we stop and we rest. But the reason he does that is it's in our nature to want to hurry through this life and keep working and keep proving ourselves all the time, to get more done. And so God has to command us that you need something that's deeply life-giving, and that's to rest. And so when it comes to Jesus' day, this is how they were supposed to be practicing this. In Jesus' day, they were supposed to wake up on the Sabbath morning to a world they didn't make and to a friendship with God they didn't earn. Isn't that great? Like they were supposed to wake up and say, God, wow, I didn't make this. I didn't make this happen. I can just rest in it. I didn't have anything to do with the friendship that you chose to have with me. But as we'll see in Jesus' time, it gets distorted really quickly. So if you look in Mark chapter 2, it says, on the Sabbath day, he was going through the grain fields, hiking with his disciples. And as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And as the Pharisees were saying to them, look what you're doing. It's not lawful on the Sabbath to pluck grain and eat it like that. And then what Jesus says to him, he tells him a story about David and how David goes in, and when he's hungry, he goes in on the Sabbath and he takes the bread that's only supposed to be for the priest and he eats it. And he's saying this on purpose. He's saying, listen, if David could do that, if David could go in there and take the bread on the Sabbath, then that shows that it's not a moral law where it's like adultery. There's never a time where you're in a pinch, David's being chased, you can commit adultery because you're in a bad spot, right? He never does that. But when it comes to the Sabbath, what Jesus is saying is, listen, this is ceremonial, and the way that this is not moral, and so God can change it. And so we see here that he says this in verse 27. He says, and he said to them, listen, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And so then he says this radical statement, so the Son of Man, which is referring to Jesus, is the Lord even over the Sabbath. That Jesus is claiming, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I'm the one who invented Sabbath. I'm the one who created this. And so he says, listen, you Pharisees and religious leaders, you have twisted the Sabbath. He says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man made for the Sabbath. And so the Pharisees act as if God had created people so that God would have someone to follow and keep the Sabbath. That's why God created them, to keep the Sabbath. And so Jesus clarifies and says, no, God has given the Sabbath as a gift to the people that he had created. And they had twisted that all around. If you look in the Mishnah, there's 39 different types of work that's prohibited, of things that you can't do. You can't light a fire. You can't throw a toothpick in the fire. I mean, it just gets really legalistic about what you can and cannot do. And then down through the ages, it starts that you can't open an umbrella, you can't turn on electricity, you can't drive a car because that's considered lighting fire. And it just becomes something where they became slaves to the Sabbath. Instead of the Sabbath being something that blessed them, it became a curse to them. They became slaves to it. So Jesus speaks out against that. Because Jesus said, look, I made the Sabbath to benefit you, to bless you, to serve you. But you Pharisees have taken it and you've turned it around and made it a curse for man. You made it a burden to them. And they became slaves to the Sabbath. The very opposite. God's trying to release them from slavery. And what we do as humanity is we learn to twist it and turn it back around and have the opposite effect. And so Jesus comes along and says, listen, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I am the ruler and the designer of rest and what that looks like. And he rebukes them for abusing and taking advantage of what God was supposed to give as a great gift. And so the question for us this morning, a lot of times as well, are we supposed to be doing that? Does God command that we have to keep the Sabbath? And if you look at Romans chapter 14, verse 5, Paul talks about Sabbath days and holy days, and he says, one person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all the days alike, and each one should be fully convinced in his own mind what he should do. So Paul doesn't say, yes, you must keep the Sabbath, even though he kept the Sabbath. He said, listen, he didn't have a quarrel with those who want to set out the Sabbath and rest and enjoy it, as long as you didn't require salvation, as long as you didn't believe that, you're a better Christian and this is what all good Christians would do. And yet at the other side, he says, you don't judge those who say every day is holy, who doesn't practice the Sabbath, as unspiritual. Because you see that, like Jesus has come to give us full rest, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the Sabbath principle is something that all believers should practice. It's in the grain of how God created us that we need regular rest. Now, the New Testament doesn't specify when that rest should take place, nor does it set forth a period of time when the rest should occur. But we can see it from the very beginning of creation, that we are supposed to rest. And so I was reading Rich Villodas' book. He talks about 4 different reminders when it comes to Sabbath. And there were some really good things he said. And one of the things he says, Sabbath is not a reward for earned earned for hard work. It's not a reward that you do just because you work hard enough. See, we live in a legalistic society and world that says if you want to rest, you got to work hard. You got to work better. You got to work more than everyone else. And then we fall into that thinking that I only deserve Sabbath rest if I've worked so hard and all my energy and I've spent up and I've done everything that I'm supposed to. And then you know what? That starts to translate into our understanding of grace as well. You know, if I have God's favor, it's something that I should be striving and deserving of. You've given it to me, now I'm going to earn it. I'm going to make sure I'm worthy of that grace. But you don't earn, much less deserve grace in the same way that we don't deserve the Sabbath. But God gives it to us. And so the Sabbath is a gift that precedes work and enables us to do work well. Because if you look in Genesis, God creates man on the sixth day. And so his first day that he wakes up and enjoys is what day? The Sabbath. So the very first day that humanity enjoys is one where God says rest and delight and take a break. And then you go on to work from there, from a place of deep, abiding rest and joy and delight in God. And so the Sabbath also reminds us that our work's incomplete, like that symphony that's never finished. It will never end. So if you think, I'll take a rest once all my work is done, there's always more dishes, right? There's always more laundry, no matter how much you do it. And if you think that you're going to have to wait till you're done, you're going to be like King Sisyphus. You remember King Sisyphus from Greek mythology? He was cursed by the gods to roll this stone up the hill. And right when he got to the top, it would roll back down. And he had to, for eternity, try to keep doing the same meaningless task over and over and over again. And that resonates with us because we can feel that same type of mentality when it comes to our work sometimes as well. And so your work's always going to be there. You can always push the rock back up the hill on Monday. But take a time to rest because there will always be work. It will never be done. And so the Sabbath day really moves us from production to presence. So we live in a society that everything's based on what you produce, and we forget that to just be present. And we attempt to achieve things and produce things and have things done all the time, work, and we just get exhausted as a result of that. And the Sabbath day is a day of presence, to be present to God, to be present towards others, to be present towards God's creation, and even to be present towards what's going on in our own hearts and lives. Because sometimes what we do is I work and I keep busy and I don't want to think about what is really going on in here and what God needs to do a work there. So Sabbath definitely has the ability to make us more productive the rest of the week. It absolutely has that. But we don't keep the Sabbath to make us more productive at work, but instead we keep the Sabbath to resist the idolatry of productivity. That we are more than just what we produce. The Sabbath is not just a rest from making things, it's also a rest from the need to make something of ourselves. And so Sabbath helps us to learn to be present in one place with God and rest and stop. And then Sabbath points to this deeper rest that we need for our souls. And so Sabbath gives a chance for our souls to rest and catch up with the rest of our bodies. And so we live lives trying to prove ourselves, to make a name for ourselves, trying to become something, work hard, to be noticed, prove that we matter to our boss, to our family, to our culture, to our society, to people, social group we're in, and it becomes exhausting to constantly try to do that. So we work our way to significance. And then we tell people we're so busy all the time. You notice that? Oh, I'm just so busy. We say we're so busy all the time. And what we're trying to do when we say that we're busy all the time is I think we're trying to prove to ourselves and to others that we matter, that the world needs us, that the world wants us, that the world actually depends on us. But here's the great news. The sun rises every day without your help. God doesn't consult you about that. He doesn't ask you to call this company or send an email to get a crane to get the sun to happen every day. He just makes it happen every day. You don't have to prepare a spreadsheet. You don't have to do anything. God makes it happen. And so the gospel wants us to put to rest that the world depends on us. We don't have to work like that anymore because Jesus has already accomplished and done all that work for us on the cross. Remember on the cross, he yells, "It is finished." All the work is done. So we can rest in him now, knowing that there's no work that we have to do to earn our salvation or try to obtain it ourselves. Jesus stayed up all night in the Garden of Gethsemane praying so that we could rest, so that we could truly have sleep. So when we stop working, we have to admit that the world doesn't depend on us, that the planets are not going to fall out of orbit, and the sun will continue to rise even if you take a day off from writing emails, from being on your phone, from being able to do everything that you think that you have to keep going. So see, the belief that we sustain the world and not God is really at the core of our unrest. That we don't think we can rest because it's up to me to keep things going. It's up to me to make things happen instead of trusting in God. And so when we Sabbath, we take a break from that, those broken rhythms of hustle and hurry and hardship, and we set aside a time to submit to God and say, God, you are ruling on your throne, that you're willing to step back and say, everything is in order. I have got this. And resting and Shabbat, Sabbath, to stop, helps us to be able to do that as well. And so Hebrews 4 says, so then there remains a Sabbath rest for God's people. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his work through the gospel as God did from his. So if you look at that, Hebrews 4 says that God entered his full Sabbath rest because his work was done. God finished the work in creation and he rested. And through Jesus Christ, he has finished the work of redemption as well. And so what does that look like for us? Application. Think about this. In your question to shape your practice of what that looks to Sabbath and rest. It's going to look different for everybody. What could I do for 24 hours or whatever time that I have that could fill my soul with deep, throbbing joy? That I can delight in, that you can step back like God and say, that's good. And I know that there's seasons of Sabbathing, sick parents, newborn babies, taking on a new job, taking on two people's jobs and having to do it. I realize there's some complexity to all that. But you have to find a way to finally say, I'm not going to keep living my life like this. I have to find some rest. And so for some of you, Sundays might be the best time to do that. But, you know, if you're on a schedule in the oil field, sometimes that doesn't work out. Or if you're someone like me, you realize that Sunday's not a day of rest for me, right? So for me, I have to try to find it some other time. And I'll be vulnerable and honest that sometimes I'm not good at that either. And so this sermon has been deeply convicting to my own life. And so I have my naive optimism, like when my baby comes, then I will have more time for resting and making Sabbath work. So Abraham Herschel, he says this, a man who works with his hands should Sabbath, a man who works with his mind should Sabbath with his hands, and a man who works with his hands should Sabbath with his mind. And I think that's a good principle that, you know, for me, a lot of times I'm reading and studying, working with my mind, and so you know what I love to do when I take days of rest is I love to mow my yard. I love to like plant flowers. I love to try to make things grow out of the West Texas ground. You know, I love it. I love working my hands because it's restful for me. But some of you who maybe work for a living, maybe that's what you need to do is on the day that you rest is that you read something, that you stimulate your mind in a different way. And that can even apply to like moms. If you parent all day long, maybe when you come to rest, you give all the kids to your husband and you let him do the parenting you normally would, and you get to do things that are restful for you, right? So you just have to think through what does that look like for you, but you need to have some contemplative time as well, to rest, to delight in God, to worship God. You need a time to nurture relationships, find good friends, life-giving friends that you can rest and just spend time with. And we talked about just having aesthetic times of just look, that's good. Whether it be like God's creation or music or arts, or maybe sit down with your family and play a game. But some of you can't do that. Some of you, that's not restful to play games, right? Because you play games and you get competitive, and halfway through the game, the Monopoly board is being thrown, and nobody is restful, right? So maybe some of you can't do that, but you have to think through, what is it that you can do? Take a walk, sit by the fire. What does that look like for you? And now remember, I love what Eugene Peterson says. He has a name for those who, Sabbath is not the same day as taking a day off. And he says he has a name for it, he calls it the bastard Sabbath. It's when you're not doing your work for your job, but you're still working. You're paying the bills on your day off, you're answering emails, you're doing a budget, you're doing the laundry. And so, yeah, you're not working for your job, but you're not truly resting. And God calls us to take a time to just be able to rest. So how's that look? It's going to be different for everybody based on your Myers-Briggs, your Enneagram, your Colby test, whatever it is that you have, your personality it's going to be different. So to close, I want to read you this from John Mark Comer when he talks about his Sabbath time. And he says this. He says, and something happens about halfway through the day, something hard to put into language. It's like my soul catches up to my body, like some deep part of me that got beaten down and drowned out by meetings and email and Twitter and relational conflict and the difficulty of life. It just comes back to the surface of my heart. And he says, and I feel free. Free from the need to do more, get more, be more. Free from the spirit, the evil demonic spirit of restlessness that has enslaved our society. I feel another spirit, the Holy Spirit, the restful calm settle over my whole person. And I find that my ordinary life is enough, that it's enough. And I think that when you take times of restful, you've ever done that where it's snowing on Christmas Eve and you feel that feeling of just rest and calm? I think God is calling all of us to experience that on a regular basis. That's his desire for us. So Jesus says it perfectly. Come to me, all you who weary and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and lowly in heart, and I will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So the way that we experience the rest Jesus offered us is not found in what we do. It's found in what Jesus has done for us. And so Jesus underwent the biggest kind of rest imaginable. He rested in the tomb after being crucified for you. He rested in a world that was being renewed and being restored and being transformed. And the world was about to see, as he rested in the tomb, resurrection and all that that implies for us. So when we put our faith in Jesus, we exchange exhaustion for rest. Because that's what he's come to do, is he's come to save us from that cancerous restlessness that we all experience. So the Sabbath reminds us of the gospel of grace, because Sabbath helps keeping us and reminds us that while we're intentionally not doing or accomplishing anything, that's when God loves you. When you're resting and you're not doing anything at all, you're not striving, you're not working, you've just stopped on Sabbath and resting, that's when God says, I love you and I care for you regardless of anything that you've done. So let's pray. I want us to just imagine Jesus coming to you and saying, come to me. I know that you're tired. I know that you're exhausted. And I'll give you rest. I know that your soul is just so wound up and overworked, and I want to give rest to your soul. So I just want us to take a minute and imagine Jesus coming to you and saying, come and find rest in me. Lord, we just trust you that you are the great creator, that you knew what you were doing when you told us we need to stop and we need to rest. And we trust you, Jesus. You are the Lord of the Sabbath, that you are the creator of rest. That's what you desire of us, that we would find our identity in the Lord of the Sabbath and not in the absence of resting and accomplishing and doing all these things. So Lord, would you teach us the balance of working hard and enjoying our work and learning to enjoy the Lord of the Sabbath, who calls us to come away and rest with you. Help us, Lord. Guide us this year. Amen.